Hello everybody, welcome back to Indycar Wednesday. I'm Gordon Ross. On today's show I'm going to talk about Donald Trump's imminent visit to Germany and the kind of things that he's been saying about Germany and how they affect the European Union and its relationship with its neighbours in Russia. Trump has been quoted as saying that Germany currently buys 60 to 70% or depends for 60 to 70% of its energy consumption on Russian gas. So this is his assertion. This is what he says is the truth. If you look at the actual facts of the matter, it's not actually true at all. What is really true is that 60% or thereabouts of Germany's gas is purchased through a Russian deal. Now they did the deal with Russia because the gas was nearer to them, it was easier to transport, the pipeline already existed, and it was the right thing to do for Germany at the time. But this gas is not 60 to 70% of Germany's entire energy requirements. They do not depend 60 to 70% of their energy on Russia at all, as Trump implies. They only have about 20% of their energy from gas, and therefore it's 60 to 70% of 20%. So it's a lot less than Trump is actually claiming. So as usual, Mr. Trump comes wading in and starts to throw his weight around in Europe and is claiming that Germany is wealthy enough to pay more, to basically just suddenly increase its spending on defence. This at a time when the European Union in general is discussing the formation of a new European defence force, a common defence policy, a common army, common air force, common navy, which is contributed to by all 27 members. The Europeans already could see that NATO was beginning to look like an American-dominated proxy war machine, which is essentially what it is. The Russians see America and the United Kingdom as proxy war fighters, people who invade other countries on the pretext of some kind of security alert which is causing problems for them. In actual fact, we know for sure that most of the invasions that have been made in the Middle East by the UK and the US together have actually not really been anything to do with weapons of mass destruction, or to do with poison gas, or to do with anything else, other than wanting to effectively sow chaos and dissent across the Middle East, to keep other oil-producing countries which don't toe the line in America's eyes, don't kowtow to America. It's to teach them a lesson, basically to keep their enemies divided. I'm not talking about their military enemies, I'm talking about their commercial enemies. Keep them divided and unable to compete against America, Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom. So this geopolitical situation that Trump is wading into is now escalated beyond being just a war of words between Europe and America. The Europeans are now seeing the writing on the wall. They see that NATO is dominated entirely by America. It completely forces all of the geopolitical moves that NATO makes and dictates to the rest of Europe what should be done, including, I have had to say, the United Kingdom and including Scotland with Trident. The Europeans are preparing for a NATO-free defence system. In other words, they're already putting the pieces together to defend their eastern borders along the Russian front, if you want to call it that. The Russians have announced in the last 2 weeks that they and China have strengthened both their military and their political alliances because of the threat that they perceive from America, primarily America and the UK. America has been increasing troop numbers along the borders of East Germany, Finland and other places for several years now, and both Britain and America have been ramping up the Russia bad rhetoric for the past 2 or 3 years. We've heard nothing but Russia's bad, Russia's bad, Russia's bad. It's almost getting as common as SNP bad. I wouldn't be surprised at some point if we don't get SNP in Russian link bad news stories shortly. But the point is that Trump is now going into a confrontation with Europe because he believes that another country, which he has nothing at all to do with, should suddenly stop trading with one of its own neighbours and should not buy any gas from it. So where does Trump expect the Germans to get their energy from? I guess he wants them to import American ethane, which has been fracked from the United States, or some other weird substance from somewhere else that America can control. He hates the idea that Russia can trade with Europe at all. The Russians, for their part, have been, to a large degree over the last few years, provoked by American and Western interference along their borders, and by American and Western encouraged coups in places like Ukraine and Crimea, with the Americans then claiming it was the Russians who were basically causing the problem in Crimea and the Ukraine, when in actual fact it was provoked by a Western coup, a takeover. We forget all this and we don't get the news as it actually happens. We get it filtered through the British media. So it looks to us as if the Russians are the bad guys. In actual fact, Russia has been getting more and more alarmed by the military build-up along its southern borders with Europe. Russia has been reaching out to people like the Germans and other European countries along their southern flank to do business with them and to form friendly links and friendly trading relations with the European bloc. And this is something that the Americans fear the most, because Russia and Europe together would be a far bigger global competitor for the United States, almost than even China would be. The combined might of both Russia and Europe together as a new allegiance is something the Americans cannot really stomach. And this is why Trump, I believe, is coming over to Germany to insult the Germans today. He tends to go on these insult tours fairly frequently, trying to annoy people, trying to stir up resentment for Europeans back at home in America, because he's playing to his own audience a lot of the time. The Americans believe that what Trump is doing is going to save America billions of dollars. Fine. If America comes out of Europe completely, NATO disbands, the European Defence Force takes over, America can go its own way. The world as we know it at the moment is undergoing tectonic political changes. The Americans are retreating into a protectionist fortress America. This is what Trump's dream is. The Europeans are consolidating Europe into a defended but friendly allegiance, so that they can do business with Russia on friendly terms and also on equal terms in terms of military might and in terms of their political aims, which are primarily to trade with Russia. Russia is a huge market for European goods. Europe is a huge market for Russian manufactured goods, and the trading possibilities for both areas are enormous. So don't be fooled by Trump. His mission is, as usual, to sow dissent and chaos amongst the Europeans, just as they've done sowing chaos amongst the Middle East as well. Back home in Scotland, somebody actually recently posted something which I had written last year. I'd written a post where I was comparing or imagining if Scotland's and England's roles were reversed, and I asked people to imagine if Scotland ruled England, and if Scotland had been in the position where it could asset strip all of England's oil fields, take whatever profit it wanted from that and give back pocket money to England. If Scotland was able to take all of the income tax and all of the corporation taxes and petroleum taxes and everything else from England, force them to put it through our treasury, top slice what we wanted for all our infrastructure here, and then give them back just a subsistence allowance. How would people in England feel about that? Because that is precisely the position that Scotland has been in for the past 3 centuries. Imagine for a moment if we were in charge of the defence of the United Kingdom and we decided that we were going to site 250 nuclear missiles in Southampton. And if we decided, because after World War II we had some stockpiles, that we were going to dump all our biological weapons on the Isle of Wight, and then we were going to tip all our spare ammunition and out-of-date ordnance into the English Channel, how would the English government and English people feel about that? And how then would maybe the home counties feel if we cleared all their forests and turned that whole area into a grouse moor for Scottish lords and gentry to come down and shoot every year or so? How would they feel about that? How would they feel about us ordering the licensed fracking of the home counties under London, under the southeast of England, under Essex, under Sussex, all around central England? How would they feel about that if we were to do that to them? And how would they feel about having to host nuclear submarines at Devonport, let's say? Fully armed nuclear submarine base there, a big target for any other nuclear power to shoot at. How would they feel about that? Because that is precisely what Scotland has been used as for the better part of a century now. We've been used as a dumping ground, as a place to store unpleasant, dangerous, unstable weaponry that the British establishment doesn't want anywhere near them. So imagine for a moment that the positions were reversed. How would English people feel in that situation if you had to live under those circumstances where your country was used as a dump, where all your taxes were siphoned off into Scotland, and where Scotland got the benefit of it all, where the Scottish cities were expanded, where our underground system was enlarged, we built new railway networks, we extended our airports at your expense? How would you feel about that if you're English? That really is what I was saying in the post last year. And this is something I'd like to try to keep pushing. We have to get other people to imagine the position of Scotland as well, to see it as it really is, not as it's presented in the media. It's presented in the media as part of a family of nations. It's not part of a family of nations at all. It's a colony which is rich in resources and which is exploited by its larger neighbour. Again, as I pointed out last night when I was in Kirkintilloch giving a talk last night, Scotland is exploited constantly. We're just used as either a dump or as a gold mine. We are basically milked for whatever they can get out of us, and we are used as a dumping ground, and we are paid pocket money, and that's the end of the story. But we have to stop thinking of ourselves as having to accept that anymore. The claim of right has guaranteed that we now have, as Scottish people who live here permanently, we have got the right to throw out any and all governments who attempt in any way to run the country badly. If we are not happy about the Tories running Scotland, if we're not happy about being in the Union, we have the right to vote ourselves out of that. A simple vote on the Treaty of Union to dissolve it, if we win that vote, whether it has a Section 30 or not, makes no difference, because Scottish law applies to this. Scottish law would say, we have a majority says that we are going to dissolve the Acts of Union and the Treaties of Union with England. Scotland would then say, we've suspended the Union, and we invite our English counterparts to the table to negotiate our separation. We demand the dissolution of the Union because the people of Scotland have said that they've had enough. Pretty much like Brexit, okay? The Brexit vote didn't have a Section 30 order, it wasn't in any way binding, and yet the British government chose to make it binding. And by doing that, under British law of legal precedence, they've established the practice of making a non-binding referendum binding, which means that they have to abide by our referendum result by their own rules, because they've established the precedent themselves. So in the long run, today's show is about two things: about the geopolitical position in Europe and what Trump is trying to do to Europe, because what he's trying to do is nasty. He is trying to split the Europeans, he's trying to insult them, he is trying to drive a wedge between America and Europe, and he doesn't need to, because Europe is about to dump Trump in big terms. They do not like Trump, and they don't like what America is becoming under him. They'd probably be quite happy to kick out all of the American forces that are supposedly defending Europe and put their own in place and do friendly deals with the Russians. across a common border on a large landmass. And they may even invite the Russians to join the Union eventually. Why not? Russians are probably as European as any other Europeans, and they have immense resources themselves. They have oil, gas. They have a nuclear industry, which is perhaps was a little bit behind the one in Europe. They are desperately in need now of things like renewable energy. Russia can also sell defensive weapons to Europe, remember, to defend against real enemies, and the real enemies who might actually want to launch some sort of attack against Europe, whoever they might be. But the Chinese and the Russians together have seen the threat from America, and they're already doing something about it. The Europeans are pulling away from America too, and they are regrouping with the European Defence Force. Trump is annoyed about this, but he can't do anything about it. He has actually brought about much of what is happening at the moment himself, just by getting elected and saying the things he says. Here in Scotland, we're sitting on the sidelines waiting for Brexit to unravel so that we can move on to the next phase of Scottish history, which is a new European paradigm for us. Because if we cut loose from the United Kingdom and its bizarre relationship with the Americans, if we cut free from that, we can ally ourselves with Europe. We can either be fully Europeans, or we can have a free trading agreement, and we can have some political and military alliances with Europe as well as a part of that. But that would be our decision to take, not London's decision to take. We don't want to be privatised under Trump's initiative with the United Kingdom. That's the way things are heading. Britain wants, or Britain I was going to say, the British establishment wants to be out of Europe completely, and it wants us to do deals with America. It wants America to buy into Britain, and for Britain to become a part of this larger American superstate, if you like. The British never felt at home inside what became known as the European Social Chapter. And this was the element of the European Union which was nothing to do with commerce and business, but was to do with people, to do with human rights and laws, to do with safety standards, food standards, animal welfare, equality, and all the things that you kind of value as a human being, which the European Union was trying to do as well. And that was the bit that the British state couldn't handle. And this is why they wanted out. They want to do business, but they don't want to obey anybody's rules, and you can't do that. Americans, they want to tell everybody what their rules are, and the Europeans are just saying no. Why should they? They don't depend on the Americans to defend them. The line of defence that the Americans provide is pretty shaky stuff. Remember that although Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons, France does. The United Kingdom does as well. And I'm sure there are a few other countries dotted around the European Union which have got access to nuclear weapons as well. Besides which, if you have Russia as an ally, they're hardly going to invade you when they're doing business with you. Trump wants Europe to fear Russia so that Europe will go along with the American plan and pay more for weapons. And guess who's going to supply the weapons to these European forces? Yes, you've guessed it, the Americans. Just like Britain is doing, like a good little lapdog, buying the F-35 fighter, when Britain and France had gone to the trouble of already developing a Eurofighter Typhoon themselves. But instead of equipping the RAF with those, they choose to buy the most expensive airplane on the planet that's ever been devised. The American F-35, dogged with problems, technical problems, massive cost overruns, the most expensive fighter aircraft in the world. That's what we have to get. The Europeans, on the other hand, have the capabilities to defend themselves. They've got the planes, the tanks, the boats, the ships, and the complex defence systems needed to defend against a nuclear attack without needing the nuclear missiles themselves. The Russians have developed one of the finest anti-missile systems on the planet, the one that shot down every single one of America's cruise missiles that were launched against Syria, except 3. 69 American cruise missiles were launched and only 3 got to their targets through the Russian defence system. That shows you how good it is. It exists. The Russians can sell that to Europe. The Europeans can buy gas from the Russians can buy food from Europe. why have a war just because Trump says so? Anyway, that's today's show. Anybody have any comments about the show today? Contact me in the usual way. But that's the bigger picture as far as I can see it. Other people obviously may have their own opinions, but I think Trump is stirring it at the moment, and he is desperately trying to stir up Europe and get it frightened of Russia. And Europe's just not frightened of Russia. That's the clear message here. I think we're going to see a split. Europe will circle its wagons and become a European defence force. America will circle its wagons and become an isolated state on its own, trying to do its own thing. But it's going to have a great deal of difficulty finding anybody to join in anymore with its unnecessary proxy wars. I'll see you later. Bye for now.